She said it out loud. My salary. Like I wasn't even in the room. I didn't flinch. If you've ever been disrespected quietly and expected to stay polite, this story is for you. Don't look away, what happens next will feel painfully familiar. That surprised me more than her words. I just folded my napkin slowly and kept my eyes on the table, already knowing this moment would matter later. There was a plan forming, quiet and steady, even before I fully named it. And there was something she didn't know, something I had been holding on to for a while now, tucked away where no one thought to look. It was Tuesday, just past 6:30 in the evening. The kitchen clock ticked too loudly, the second hand jerking forward like it was impatient. The coffee pot had been left on too long, giving off that sharp burnt smell that clings to curtains. Outside, the porch light flickered on as the sun slipped behind the neighboring houses. Ordinary details. That's what made it worse. She sat across from me, hands wrapped neatly around her mug, lips pressed into a thin, polite smile. The kind of smile that pretends to be curiosity but isn't. My husband sat beside me, shoulders rounded, eyes fixed on the table as if the wood grain might save him. No one rushed to defend me. No one even cleared their throat. So, she said, tilting her head, what exactly are you making these days? The question landed wrong. Too casual. Too confident. Like she had every right to ask. I felt a small tightening in my chest, not panic, not anger, but something colder. Awareness. I noticed how my fingers tingled against the ceramic plate, how my jaw stayed relaxed even as my stomach sank. I had seen this kind of moment before, just never aimed so directly at me. I answered evenly. Not numbers. Not details. Just enough to be polite. Her eyes narrowed just a fraction, as if she'd expected more. That flicker of confusion passed quickly, replaced by something sharper. Entitlement, maybe. Or disappointment. She laughed softly, the sound thin. Well, you know, she said, glancing at my husband, when family does well, it affects everyone. That was the first clue. Not the words, but the assumption behind them. I looked at my husband then. He didn't look back. He shifted in his chair, the leg scraping the floor, and reached for his water like he suddenly needed it. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and telling. I felt my face warm, but my voice stayed steady. Inside, though, memories lined up one after another. Little comments. Side questions. The way she'd listened too closely before. The way she'd remembered things I hadn't meant to share. I realized this wasn't curiosity. It was inventory. The clock ticked again. 6:37 now. I noticed a small crack in the wall near the cabinet, one I'd been meaning to fix. I wondered briefly why it had never bothered me before. Maybe because cracks are easy to ignore until they spread. She leaned back in her chair, clearly encouraged by the lack of resistance. I just think it's important to be open, she said. Especially when money is involved. That's when I understood the betrayal wasn't just hers. It was shared. Information had been passed along. Conversations had happened without me. I felt it settle into place like a puzzle piece clicking in. Not painful. Just final. I smiled then. Not warmly. Not coldly. Just enough. I took a sip of my burnt coffee and set the mug down carefully, the sound a little louder than necessary. My heart was beating faster now, but my hands were still. I'm open, I said. Just not confused about boundaries. She blinked. My husband finally looked up, his eyes wide for half a second before he masked it. I could almost see him realizing that something had shifted, something he hadn't prepared for. The air in the room felt heavier, like before a storm. She started to respond, but I raised my hand slightly. Not dramatic. Just enough to stop her. I turned fully toward my husband then, meeting his eyes directly for the first time that evening. Did you tell her? I asked. The room went very quiet. He didn't answer right away. That silence stretched longer than it should have, and I let it. I didn't rush to fill it. I didn't repeat myself. I simply waited, watching his face change as he realized I wasn't rescuing him this time. His mother's eyes moved between us, sharp and alert, sensing the shift even if she didn't yet understand it. I might have mentioned it, he said finally, voice low. Just in passing. I nodded once. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. My chest felt tight now, but my mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in years. I pushed my chair back gently and stood, collecting my plate and mug. No drama. No tears. Just movement. Silence was my first weapon, and I could feel its weight already doing the work. I'm tired, I said. I'm going to turn in. No one stopped me. Not then. That night I didn't sleep much. The house sounded different after midnight. Louder somehow. The hum of the refrigerator. The old pipes knocking. My husband shifted beside me, restless as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. I lay still, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow and uneven, and made a quiet decision. I wouldn't explain myself anymore. Not tonight. Maybe not ever again. The next morning I moved differently. Quieter. More deliberate. I made coffee but didn't offer any. I answered questions with short replies. When my husband asked if I was upset, I said, "I'm thinking," and left it at that. It wasn't a lie. Thinking takes space, and I began to take mine. Over the next few days I pulled back in small ways that were easy to miss unless you were looking for them. I stopped sharing my schedule. I kept my paperwork in a drawer I locked. When his mother called, I let it go to voicemail. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. Distance, I learned quickly, doesn't announce itself. It just appears one choice at a time. She noticed. Of course she did. At Sunday dinner she asked fewer questions but watched more closely. Her compliments felt rehearsed, her concern exaggerated. When she asked how work was going, I smiled and said, "Fine," and passed the potatoes. My husband fidgeted, clearing his throat too often, trying to bridge a gap he didn't understand yet. Later, when he cornered me in the hallway, his voice dropped. "You're being cold," he said. "I'm being careful," I replied. That was new. Saying it out loud made something settle inside me. Careful felt right. Necessary. I had spent years being open, accommodating, generous with information and effort. I saw now how easily that had been mistaken for permission. Small requests started coming. A suggestion here. A hint there. His mother asked if I could help cover something, just this once. I declined pleasantly. My husband asked why I was being so firm. I told him I was tired of being assumed. He didn't argue, but his silence felt different now. Defensive. Uneasy. One afternoon I noticed a folder on his desk with my name on it. Not malicious. Just careless. Bills. Notes. Things that shouldn't have been shared. I didn't confront him then. I closed the folder and put it back exactly where I found it. Another quiet note added to the growing list in my mind. At the grocery store, pushing my cart down familiar aisles, I felt strangely calm. The world hadn't changed. I had. The fluorescent lights hummed, a child cried near the cereal, and I realized I wasn't afraid of what might happen next. I was more afraid of staying the same. At home the tension thickened. He tried kindness, then humor, then frustration. I met each attempt with consistency. Not cruelty. Just distance. I stopped managing his discomfort. I stopped smoothing things over. One evening he finally asked, "Are you pulling away?" I looked at him, really looked. The lines around his eyes, the uncertainty he didn't know how to hide. "I'm pulling inward," I said. "There's a difference." He didn't understand that yet. But he would. The house felt quieter as the days passed. Not empty. Intentional. I was no longer filling space that wasn't mine to fill. And while no one said it outright, everyone felt it. The access was gone. The assumptions no longer landed. I didn't know exactly where this was leading. I only knew one thing for certain. Silence had opened the door. Distance was teaching them what it meant when a woman finally stepped back and stopped being available. Distance was teaching them what it meant, and I decided it was time to stop reacting and start setting terms. The next morning I sat at the small desk by the window and opened my notebook. The one I used for practical things. Lists. Dates. Notes that didn't rely on memory. My hands shook at first, then steadied. I wrote down what belonged to me, what I was responsible for, and what I would no longer carry for anyone else. Seeing it in ink changed how it felt in my body. Saw it. I didn't announce anything. I simply began to act differently. I scheduled appointments without consulting anyone. I redirected mail to a new box. I changed a few passwords and felt a strange mix of guilt and relief, like locking a door I should have locked years ago. Nothing dramatic. Just careful steps that added up. When my husband noticed, it came out sideways. "Why is the bank calling you instead of us?" he asked, trying to sound casual. I kept my eyes on the sink, rinsing a cup that didn't need rinsing. "Because it's my account," I said. He paused. "It's always been that way." "Not in practice," I replied, and that was the truth. saying it didn't feel sharp. It felt accurate. He grew quiet after that. Watchful. I could feel him recalculating, unsure of the rules because the rules had changed without permission. That was the point. I wasn't asking anymore. His mother tested it next. She showed up mid-afternoon with a bag of groceries and a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. I let her in. I offered coffee. I didn't offer information. When she mentioned a bill she thought I should help with, I listened, nodded, and said no. Calmly. Curry. Once. She laughed, then stopped when she realized I wasn't joking. I thought we were family, she said. We are, I answered. That doesn't mean we share finances. The room went still. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a lawn mower started up, distant and ordinary. She studied my face like she was looking for a crack. There wasn't one. After she left, my husband was angry. Not loud. Tight. You embarrassed her, he said. I told the truth, I said. Those aren't the same thing. We argued then, but it wasn't the old kind. No circling. No apologizing just to end it. I stayed seated. I stayed steady. I told him what I would discuss and what I wouldn't. Each boundary felt like lifting a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. That evening, alone in the bedroom, I felt the cost of it. My chest ached. My shoulders burned. Change isn't painless, even when it's right. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, breathing through it, reminding myself that discomfort wasn't danger. Over the next weeks, the house adjusted around me. Schedules shifted. Expectations fell away. Some things broke down entirely. Others worked better than before. I noticed how often I'd been filling silence with reassurance, fixing problems that weren't mine. Without that, the air felt clearer. I handled my affairs methodically. Phone calls made. Forms signed. Conversations kept short and factual. Each task brought a small sense of order. Not revenge. Control. There's a difference, and I was learning it one decision at a time. My husband tried again one night, softer this time. I don't recognize you, he said, not unkindly. I considered that. The woman I'd been had survived by smoothing edges and swallowing discomfort. The woman I was becoming stood straighter even when it hurt. I recognize myself, I said. That unsettled him more than anger ever had. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized the set of my mouth. Firmer. Tired but resolved. I remembered being younger, believing fairness came from giving more. Age teaches differently. It teaches balance, and balance requires limits. I felt older and stronger. Friends noticed. One asked if I was all right. I said yes because I was. I was learning to stand inside myself without leaning, and that knowledge settled. I didn't know where this would end, but I knew what I was done with. I was done negotiating my worth. Done explaining boundaries as if they were preferences. I hadn't raised my voice once, and yet everything had changed. The rules were different now, written quietly, enforced steadily, and no longer open for debate. The rules were different now, written quietly, enforced steadily, and no longer open for debate, and everyone in the house seemed to sense it before they understood it. My husband started saying I was distant. The word followed me from room to room, hanging in the air like a complaint that wanted agreement. I didn't correct him. I let him believe it if he needed to. What I was actually doing took more effort than distance ever had. I was closing doors I had once kept wide open out of habit and hope. It showed in small ways first. I stopped rearranging my day around his moods. I left the room when conversations turned circular. I no longer softened my answers to make them easier to accept. Each choice felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, like placing a final hand on a latch and deciding not to turn back. He tried to pull me into familiar patterns. A joke here. A shared memory there. One night he reached for my hand while we watched television, squeezing gently, waiting for reassurance. I let my hand rest there for a moment, then withdrew it calmly. The hurt on his face was real and I felt it, but I didn't undo myself to soothe it. That was new. That was hard. His mother grew restless. She called more often, left messages that sounded concerned but felt investigative. When I returned her calls, I kept them short. Polite. Controlled. She asked if something was wrong. I told her everything was clear. That answer unsettled her more than any argument could have. A new tension settled into the house, heavier than anger. It was the tension of uncertainty. They didn't know what I was doing, only that something had changed and wasn't changing back. I noticed how often my husband lingered in doorways. watching me as if trying to read instructions written somewhere on my face. One afternoon I overheard him on the phone, voice low and tight. I didn't catch every word, but I heard my name and the familiar tone of justification. When he saw me, he stopped talking abruptly. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't need to. That door had already closed. Later, he confronted me, standing at the kitchen counter where the light always flickered. "You're shutting us out," he said. Not accusing. Almost pleading. "I'm protecting myself," I answered. Saying it out loud made my throat ache, but it also made me stand straighter. "From what?" he asked. I looked at him, then really looked, and realized he wanted a simple answer. Something he could fix quickly. "From being assumed," I said. "From being used without being seen." He didn't reply. His silence was no longer empty. It was crowded with realization. Practical challenges followed. Shared responsibilities became awkward. Decisions stalled. He asked me to handle things I used to manage automatically, and I declined without explanation. Not punishment. Alignment. I was only carrying what belonged to me now. I sought small anchors outside the house. A walk with a neighbor. A quiet lunch alone. Familiar routines that reminded me I existed beyond their expectations. At a cafe one morning, I caught my reflection in the window and saw a woman who looked tired but unbent. Steadied me. At home, the emotional distance grew sharper because I refused to disguise it. My husband asked if I was planning something. I told him I was finishing something. That answer stayed with him. I could see it working its way through his thoughts. His mother tried one last approach, arriving unannounced with a soft voice and concerned eyes. She spoke about family and unity. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I thanked her for stopping by and walked her to the door. No debate. No invitation to continue. Her confusion followed her down the steps. That night the house felt smaller. Quieter. I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds, knowing they no longer belonged to the same life they once had. I wasn't pulling away. I was sealing the last opening, carefully, consciously, knowing that once closed, it would not reopen the same way again. I wasn't pulling away. I was sealing the last opening, carefully, consciously, knowing that once closed, it would not reopen the same way again. That certainty carried me into the morning. I woke before dawn, the house still dark, and sat at the kitchen table with a single envelope in front of me. Inside were copies of documents I had gathered quietly over months. Accounts in my name. Records of transfers I never approved. Notes I had written after conversations I was told never happened. This was the advantage no one suspected I had. Not leverage to threaten, but truth to end confusion. I listened to the house breathe around me. The hum of the heater. The distant sound of a delivery truck passing somewhere down the street. I felt older in that moment, but not weaker. Age had taught me patience, and patience had given me clarity. When my husband came in, rubbing sleep from his eyes, he stopped short. He knew. The air told him something had reached its end. I didn't invite him to sit. I waited until he did it on his own. "I'm not leaving in anger," I said. My voice surprised us both with its steadiness. "I'm leaving in order." He opened his mouth, then closed it. For once, he didn't rush ahead of me. I slid the envelope across the table. He didn't touch it at first. "You should read that," I said. Not to argue. Just to understand. He did. Fully. His face drained of color as recognition replaced denial. The small justifications he had carried collapsed one by one. He looked up at me, eyes wet, and whispered my name like an apology. "This isn't about blame anymore," I said. "It's about consequence." He asked if there was anything he could do. The question came too late, but not cruelly. I told him the truth. Some doors only close after being ignored for too long. Later that day his mother called. I answered. Not out of obligation but closure. She spoke carefully, already aware that something had shifted beyond repair. I told her plainly that my finances, my decisions, and my future were no longer open for discussion. When she protested, I reminded her that respect is not inherited. It is practiced. The line went quiet. Then it ended. Packing was simpler than I expected. I took what mattered. Left what didn't. Each drawer I closed felt lighter than the last. I paused in the hallway, touching the wall with a small crack, smiling at how fitting it felt to leave it unfinished. Some repairs are not meant to be made. As I carried the last bag to the car, my hands trembled not with fear but release. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, breathing, feeling my heart slow. I realized I wasn't escaping. I was arriving somewhere new, even if I didn't yet know the address. Before I walked out, my husband asked, "Was this revenge?" I considered the word. The years I'd spent shrinking. The nights I'd explained myself into exhaustion. The silence I'd learned to use like armor. "No," I said. "Revenge would have been staying and disappearing. This is choosing myself." The door closed behind me with a soft, final sound. Outside, the air was cool, early sunlight catching on the windshields along the street. A neighbor waved without knowing why it mattered. Nothing dramatic happened. No music swelled. But inside me something aligned. In the weeks that followed, life didn't magically smooth itself out. There were lonely evenings. Doubt crept in sometimes, especially at night when old habits tried to return. But there was also relief. I slept deeper. I laughed easier. I handled my affairs without fear of explanation or permission. I noticed how my body felt different. Shoulders lower. Breath fuller. The constant tightness I once carried had loosened. Even my reflection felt kinder, more familiar, like someone I had been missing for years. There were moments of sadness too, but they passed without swallowing me. I let them come and go, trusting myself to remain whole. I learned that freedom feels quiet at first, almost unfamiliar, before it settles into strength and calm certainty. Friends noticed the change before I named it. They said I looked lighter. I felt it too. Not because I had won, but because I had stopped losing pieces of myself to keep others comfortable. One afternoon I returned to that cafe and sat by the window. Watching people pass, I realized the revenge wasn't humiliation or punishment. It was becoming unreachable to those who mistook access for entitlement. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't destroyed anyone. I had simply walked away with my dignity intact. Walking away didn't break me. Put me back together. If this story spoke to something you've lived, you're not alone. Subscribe for more powerful stories about boundaries, betrayal, and the quiet strength of women who finally choose themselves.